the video as you watch and take notes over the yellow highlighted text. You'll also be asked to make some sketches throughout this presentation. There are several functions of the cell membrane. Write down all of these in your notes. It protects the cell. It controls what's coming in and going out of the cell. It maintains the concentration of various substances on either side of the cell. And it's selectively permeable. That's an important phrase. That means it keeps certain molecules in and certain molecules out. And all of these functions help the cell to maintain homeostasis, or the perfect internal balance. And just FYI, the cell membrane is also sometimes called the plasma membrane. The cell membrane is made up of a double layer of phospholipids we call a phospholipid bilayer. The structure of the bilayer helps to protect the cell, as the hydrophilic or water-loving heads will interact freely with water-based molecules inside and outside the cell, but the hydrophobic tails inside, facing each other, act like a waterproof barrier that helps to keep certain molecules inside or outside of the cell. Make a quick sketch of the phospholipid bilayer in the yellow box and label it. The cell membrane also contains proteins that help transport materials across the membrane. We're going to talk about them a little bit later. The cell membrane has what is described as a fluid mosaic model, meaning that its components are not anchored down in one place. Instead, they can move around in a sea of phospholipids. We're going to learn about 4 types of movement across the cell membrane: diffusion, osmosis, facilitated diffusion, and active transport. There are 2 main categories of cell transport: passive transport and active transport. In passive transport, substances move across the cell membrane without using any of the cell's energy. And processes of diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis are all examples of passive transport. Active transport, on the other hand, requires the cell to spend some of its energy to get work done. Diffusion is the simple and random movement of particles from high to low concentration, much like our demonstration we did with the dye particles or the air freshener. Diffusion is passive, requiring no energy to be spent. Some molecules, such as water, oxygen, and carbon dioxide, are so small that they can slide right past hydrophobic tails of the phospholipid bilayer. They will move until equilibrium is reached on both sides of the cell membrane. The next type of passive transport we're going to explore is called osmosis. Osmosis is the diffusion of water through a selectively permeable membrane when the solutes or particles are too large to move through it. So instead, water moves from high to low concentration to balance out the concentration of solutes. In other words, it waters them down. To talk about osmosis, we need to know some vocabulary describing solution concentrations. A hypotonic solution has a lower concentration of solutes compared to another one, and hypo sounds like low, so that's easy to remember. A hypertonic solution has a higher concentration of solutes, so that's kind of easy to remember too, because hyper sounds like higher. An isotonic solution has an equal concentration of solutes compared to another. These are all relative terms when we're comparing 2 or more solutions. So kind of like you'd say there's a tall person and a short person. It doesn't really make sense unless you're comparing 2 people. Animal cells are going to look different depending on what type of solution they're in. Draw and sketch these examples, and we'll go through each example on the upcoming slides. Pause the video now to sketch. In this example, a blood cell, which has all sorts of solutes inside of it, is placed in distilled water. The solutes want to move out of the cell to balance their concentration with the outside of the cell. However, they're too large to get across the cell membrane, and they're repelled by those hydrophobic tails. So instead, water molecules are going to move into the cell to balance out the solution concentration. This will cause the cell to swell and perhaps even explode. This is called cytolysis, or cells exploding, and it's not an ideal situation in our bodies. If your blood cells are placed in a hypertonic solution, the solutes want to move into the hypotonic cell to balance the concentration, but they're too large to move across the membrane. So instead, water inside the cells is going to move from high to low concentration, causing the cells to shrivel. This is called plasmolysis, and it is also not an ideal situation for your cells. This is what would happen to our bodies if we drank a lot of ocean water because it has so much salt in it. If your cells are placed into an isotonic solution, then they will be at equilibrium. Water will move across the membrane but remain balanced on both sides of the membrane. That's why if you go to the hospital for dehydration, they're going to give you an IV with saline solution because saline is isotonic compared to your blood cells. Next, we're going to focus on the role of those proteins we saw earlier in the cell membrane and their jobs with cell transport. To facilitate means to help. Proteins embedded in the cell membrane help to transport certain particles across the cell membrane if they're too large or they have a charge that does not allow them to pass through the hydrophobic tails. These proteins are specific about which particles they're going to allow across the membrane. This is also a passive process, so no energy is spent by the cell. This diagram shows a transport protein allowing large glucose molecules to move across the membrane. Glucose is energy for our cells, but it cannot get past the hydrophobic tails on its own, so the proteins recognize it and open up like a tunnel to allow it to cross the membrane. So remember, only certain proteins are going to be allowed to cross. Stop the video for a minute and draw what you see here in the diagram as an example of facilitated diffusion. Active transport is when the cell has to spend energy in the form of ATP, which is a molecule we'll learn more about later, and it's moving molecules from low to high concentration or going against the flow. It's a little bit like swimming upstream. It's a lot of work. Sometimes cells need the extra molecules, so it's worth spending the energy to move them in this way. Pause the video and draw the example inside the yellow box in your notes. All right, go to Google Classroom now and see what you've learned by watching the Ed puzzle about cell transport.